Há milhares de anos, as leis de Moisés foram dadas aos israelitas. Leis que prescrevem as relações dos homens com Deus e uns com os outros. Leis que proíbem o adultério, o perjúrio, o roubo e o assassinato.
All of these things can wreak havoc in a society that depends on stability for economic survival.
Mas ao longo dos séculos, essas leis foram interpretadas de modos diferentes. Algumas sociedades as seguiram ao pé da letra, outras não.
We don't accept the commandments about adultery. We don't particularly accept the commandments about coveting.
Essas leis ainda têm lugar em nossa sociedade moderna? O que as proibições significavam então? E teriam algum significado hoje?
They are not American law. We don't have laws today prohibiting several of the things that are in the Ten Commandments.
We're not dealing with dry, dusty laws, but laws given by a living God.
Os 10 Mandamentos, segunda parte. Os 10 Mandamentos. A palavra de Deus talhada na pedra. Um símbolo sagrado da aliança entre Deus e os israelitas. No Êxodo e no Deuteronômio, lemos que Moisés trouxe os mandamentos em 2 tábuas. A tradição divide os mandamentos em 2 partes, metade em uma tábua, metade na outra. A primeira trata de Deus e como deve ser adorado.
You shall have no other gods before me. Secondly, you shall not portray this God in any way. You shall not make an idol. Thirdly, you shall not abuse the name of God. Number 4, you are supposed to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy.
Mas e a segunda série de mandamentos? Se os primeiros são leis religiosas, os outros são leis morais.
You are to not ever commit murder or killing. You are not to commit adultery. You are not to steal. You are not to bear false witness against your neighbor.
They provided a new society with the means of living with their God and with one another.
Além dessas 2 ideias distintas, um mandamento faz a ponte entre as leis religiosas e morais. Honrarás pai e mãe. Os pais são o elo entre Deus e a próxima geração de seu povo. Honra teu pai e tua mãe, para que teus dias se prolonguem sobre a terra. Êxodo 20, 12. Na era bíblica, isso era questão de sobrevivência. Nesse tempo, quem vivia em uma aldeia ou em uma tribo eram grupos de não mais que 2 ou 3 famílias estendidas.
The elders of a village were the heads of the various families, and a family would consist of all of the living male relatives, descendants of a living male elder, and their spouses and their children.
Dentro do grupo, todas as propriedades eram comunitárias. Arar, irrigar e colher eram tarefas compartilhadas.
Every member of the family had a particular important and critical role to play. The stability of that extended family had significant economic implications, not only for your survival, but the survival of the families that cooperate with you, work with you, harvest with you, plant with you, defend each other in times of danger.
Na comunidade, a propriedade passava do pai para o filho mais velho. O filho devia honrar o pai, continuando a trabalhar na terra e sustentando os outros membros da família. Honrava a mãe, que não herdava nada, sustentando e cuidando dela. Não fazer isso era arriscar o futuro de toda a comunidade.
Family structure in ancient Israel was the key to financial and physical survival. If this gets destabilized through adultery, through irresponsibility, through failure to live up to your economic expectations, it can have catastrophic implications.
Era um princípio partilhado por outras comunidades que lutavam pela sobrevivência. Os puritanos, por exemplo, tinham outra versão dos mandamentos, com punições extraídas do Levítico. Quem amaldiçoar o pai ou a mãe será punido com a morte. Levítico 29.
In Massachusetts Bay in the 17th century, a stubborn or rebellious son of 16 or over was, according to the rule, liable to be put to death. But in fact, as far as we know, this rule was never enforced. But it was put on the books partly as a symbolic act.
Para os puritanos, assim como para os israelitas, era natural que a lei sobre os pais encerrasse a primeira metade dos mandamentos, as leis que regem a relação dos homens com Deus. É a segunda metade dos mandamentos, que não tratam de ofensas contra Deus, mas contra o próximo, que mais se parecem com os códigos penais da atualidade, apoiando o argumento de que os mandamentos são parte da tradição legal americana.
There is a common good, that there are a set of principles and laws that we need to live together peaceably in a society, and the Ten Commandments informs us on how to do that.
Muitos mandamentos tratavam de leis de propriedade, um conceito novo para os israelitas que vagavam em busca da terra prometida.
They're moving from being a wandering people to a people who will be more based on a particular piece of land.
Well, the Ten Commandments certainly regulate the relationships between people as it relates to what they own.
Não cobiçarás os bens de teu próximo. Não dormirás com a mulher de teu próximo. Não roubarás o boi de teu próximo. Não levantarás falso testemunho contra teu próximo. E o mandamento mais elementar: não matarás.
It says nothing about abortion. It says nothing about capital punishment. It says nothing about military activities.
Doesn't mean all.
Controvertidos mandamentos. A Bíblia, como o mundo moderno, está cheia de histórias de crimes e assassinatos acidentais ou premeditados. E o que realmente significa o mandamento que os proíbe? Não matarás.
Some of the interpretations say, thou shalt not kill, but there are two very distinct words in Hebrew, one for murder and one for killing. And the Ten Commandments uses the word for murder, not killing.
The problem with that interpretation that says that it's murder is that the term used for kill in the Ten Commandments is used in other contexts in the Old Testament where it's clearly not murder that's being talked about, it's killing. And so there is an ambiguity to this law.
O sentido do mandamento tornou-se pomo da discórdia em debates modernos sobre vida e morte.
It says nothing about abortion. It says nothing about capital punishment. It says nothing about military activities. So, yes, matters of interpretation, just of translation, are dominant.
Crimes, guerras e assassinatos abundam no Velho Testamento, de Caim e Abel em diante. Até mesmo Moisés, no Êxodo, mata um egípcio que maltratava um de seus parentes. Depois organiza um exército para combater os amalequitas. E mortes por execução eram punições comuns para quem violava os dogmas antigos, inclusive os 10 mandamentos. A pena por não guardar o sabá, por adultério e por perjúrio era morte por apedrejamento. Mas no caso de assassinato, há outras leis entre as 613 que Moisés decretou em outros livros do Velho Testamento que levam em conta motivos e circunstâncias.
There were certain forms of killing that were allowed, and essentially this would be in self-defense, in warfare, and in capital punishment. What was most feared in a community was killing someone for no reason at all, because someone that would do something like that was seen as a threat to the whole community.
No Deuteronômio aparece pela primeira vez o famoso princípio olho por olho, dente por dente. Não como um apelo à vingança, mas à contenção.
An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth meant no more than an eye for an eye, no more than a tooth for a tooth, no more than a life for a life. It introduced proportionality, it introduced reason and the rule of law.
Mas com a ascensão do Império Romano no primeiro século depois de Cristo, a questão tornou-se irrelevante. O direito romano aboliu as leis de todas as culturas que caíram sob seu domínio. Na ocupação romana, todos os crimes tinham de passar pela jurisdição romana. Os judeus e os primeiros cristãos não podiam mais aplicar as leis de Moisés sem a aprovação de César. Após a queda de Roma no século V e a invasão da Europa pelos hunos, góticos e outros bárbaros, a pena para o assassinato deixou de ser a morte. Em uma sociedade de guerreiros, a morte era apenas rotina. Para evitar disputas, a Wehrgeld, uma espécie de indenização, era paga às famílias das vítimas. Bens ou moedas deviam compensá-las pela perda.
Depending on who you were in society, whether you're a member of the elite or just somebody who was a very poor person or somebody at the lowest level of the economy, everybody had a certain value.
As antigas leis e punições voltaram aos poucos após 1066, enquanto o sistema feudal da Idade Média se sedimentava. Outra vez, pais comandavam as famílias, senhores comandavam os vassalos. E o rei, com a ajuda da igreja, respondia somente a Deus. Nos 3 séculos seguintes, os 10 mandamentos foram impostos violentamente. As vidas eram miseráveis, mas as penas para assassinato eram altas.
It's unimaginable the amount of homicide that probably took place in medieval England. Some explanations have said, well, alcohol consumption. Other people say that it was a learned experience. Basically, they lived in a culture that kind of enjoyed jousting and this type of entertainment. Others say that people were bound up in these relationships with each other in guilds or in kinship groups, and that they always came to each other's aid. People didn't have much property, and so people would kill each other over a cowbell.
Segundo as leis medievais, não havia graus de assassinato. Os únicos vereditos inocente ou culpado eram decididos em combate entre cavaleiros. Para os outros, o julgamento era o ordalho. Quem sobrevivia era considerado inocente. Quem não resistia aos ferimentos era culpado.
Trial by ordeal can be found in almost every culture in recorded history, and there's a lot of evidence that it was used in prehistoric cultures as well. Because it's placing the utmost faith, when there isn't a criminal justice system, in God or gods for determining guilt or innocence. The ordeal in most cases was a no-win situation. There might be an ordeal of fire and water, putting your hand into boiling water or boiling oil.
Em 1215, a Igreja Católica exigiu o fim dessa prática.
We see the elimination of an important part of the criminal justice process, and it has to be replaced with something else. And it's at this point in history that we see England moving towards the common law tradition, moving towards the adversarial system and the jury system.
Oficialmente, ainda havia apenas 2 escolhas: culpado ou inocente. Mas os jurados medievais, vizinhos ou da vítima ou do acusado, seguiam suas próprias leis tácitas. Muitas vezes o acusado era absolvido com base no que se sabia sobre os indivíduos e as circunstâncias do crime. Quando o sistema chegou ao Novo Mundo, tentou-se integrar o exame das circunstâncias às leis oficiais.
The first colony to experiment with degrees of homicide was the Pennsylvania colony. We start to see a movement towards banning any type of execution except for treason and first-degree murder. And this was a very important turning point.
Foi tanto uma ideia revolucionária quanto um retorno à tradição hebraica, em que as proibições dos 10 mandamentos podiam ser vistas em um contexto maior de leis. Mas pode haver justificativa para desobedecer a esse mandamento? Já existiram nos casos de guerra, pena de morte e outras circunstâncias atenuantes citadas no Velho Testamento. Essa ideia que surgiu no começo do século XX foi levada a extremos. Insanidade, sonambulismo, acidente, alterações biológicas. Há centenas de atenuantes para assassinato, mas somente uma era aceita pelo público no começo. Ironicamente, está ligada ao mandamento que vem depois de não matarás: a proibição do adultério.
There was a scarlet letter. This is not just a myth.
Hoje é o que alimenta tabloides, reality shows e comédias. Mas nos tempos bíblicos o assunto não era brincadeira. Era uma lei imutável. Não cometerás adultério.
Adultery is not bad only because it is sexually immoral. I mean, that's sort of a modern way of thinking it. Adultery had catastrophic economic consequences. Land was associated with clear family lines. There had to be a clear sense of who was inheriting land. Early in ancient Israel, only men could inherit land, so you had to be very clear whose son is whose son, and how is this land going to be distributed.
Para as mulheres antigamente, ter um filho era uma questão de sobrevivência.
If a woman in a marriage does not have a son to inherit the family land, she's in trouble. She can't possess land herself. That land could pass to another relative of that family. So, what's supposed to happen? If she does not have a male child, if she does not have an heir, then the next male relative is supposed to sleep with her, provide her with a child. Biblical law considers that child to be the child of the deceased male. Therefore, that child is provided by God and by the nearest male relative so that the line can carry on, so that the inheritance can proceed.
No mundo antigo, era a mulher que pagava pelo adultério, mesmo em Roma, que já era decadente nessa época. No ano 18 a.C., o imperador Augusto, alarmado pela diminuição de filhos legítimos na classe alta, decretou leis que tornavam o adultério um crime passível de morte ou exílio. Pais e maridos tinham permissão para matar mulheres pegas em flagrante. Mas as transgressões continuaram até que Augusto foi obrigado a banir a própria filha devido ao crime. Depois da queda de Roma no século V, o adultério deixou de ser considerado um pecado grave. Para as hordas de bárbaros e para os camponeses medievais que trabalhavam para os senhores feudais, não havia posse de terra nem herança sagrada. Linhagem, herança e adultério eram preocupações da elite, principalmente da nobreza. No século XV, Henrique VIII tornou o adultério um crime de alta traição para suas esposas, mas deixou seus filhos ilegítimos permanecerem na linha de sucessão. Tudo isso mudou no século seguinte. Para os puritanos no final do século XVI, mesmo no Novo Mundo, onde a terra era abundante e tornou-se direito de nascença, o adultério voltou a ser crime grave em todas as classes.
The punishment for adultery in Massachusetts Bay was death, but this was actually not enforced after about the middle of the 17th century. There are no known cases in which adulterers were actually put to death. However, it was considered a very serious crime. And the notion of the Scarlet Letter is something we do find reflected in the records of the colonies.
A letra escarlate que o escritor Nathaniel Hawthorne celebrizou no livro do mesmo nome era um castigo puritano comum. As adúlteras podiam ser chicoteadas ou exibidas no pelourinho, mas também eram obrigadas a bordar a letra A na frente da roupa.
It was a shaming punishment. punishments that mark a person, and so expose them to stigma and shame. The other forms of shaming punishment are very well known: sitting in the stocks or having your head ducked in water and so on. And the idea was that by inflicting shame on you, you would be punished by the community, and afterwards you would rejoin the community.
Na primeira e na segunda vez, os pecadores eram punidos desse modo para se redimirem. Mas reincidentes enfrentavam a morte ou o exílio, o que no selvagem Novo Mundo podia ser a mesma coisa.
Adultery was punished for the same reason that other sexual crimes were punished. The Puritan colonies believed very strongly that there was no such thing as a victimless crime. That's a modern phrase they didn't understand. If people were going to commit sodomy, adultery, fornication, that God would strike the whole community. So the whole community would suffer unless these acts were punished and made to stop, which they never succeeded in doing, of course.
Com o crescimento do país, ficou mais difícil policiar o adultério e outros crimes sexuais.
By the time we get into the period of the early republic, we have a much more complex society. If you have cities that are full of strangers, newcomers, sailors, prostitutes, gamblers, rowdies, and so the whole system of criminal justice based on neighbors observing neighbors, shaming, and so on, begins to erode and eventually disappears.
No período vitoriano do século XIX, o adultério continuava ilegal, mas só era levado a juízo se também fosse aberto e notório.
These new rules about adultery are a good example of something I like to call the Victorian compromise. It's a realization that vice, sin, offenses against morality can't really be stamped out, and that all society can do is to try to contain them. So if you can control open and notorious adultery, that's all you can hope to do, and let the sporadic clandestine acts, let them continue.
O adultério era julgado nos tribunais só quando se tornava público, como aconteceu em alguns julgamentos de assassinato.
Adultery in the 19th century was often punished only when it was open and notorious. So there was a kind of unwritten law that if you murdered the lover of your wife, you would be acquitted, even though nothing in the official law ever said so.
No século XX, o adultério se tornou ainda menos relevante.
Adultery, of course, has been decriminalized in most states in America. With the decriminalization of that provision has also led to no-fault divorce laws. It used to be that persons needed particular grounds to seek divorcement, such as adultery. Now, has that benefited our culture or not?
Hoje, as pessoas envolvidas precisam ser famosas para que o adultério seja notícia.
We have sort of this conflicted view about sex. Sometimes we think it's really private, it's off limits from public discussion. But if it's a high-profile person doing it, like Bill Clinton or Kobe Bryant, all of a sudden it's a major legal issue for the whole community to look at. Bill Clinton got impeached because he was engaging in what we today would call adultery. He was having sex outside of the marriage.
Para o público moderno, o adultério é mais passatempo do que crime.
We live in a society where, frankly, we're a bit ambivalent about adultery. It happens so much, it's portrayed in the movies, and so we're not quite sure whether we think it's that cardinal sin that it used to be.
Mas nem todo país moderno tem essa visão ambivalente.
What has happened recently, there have been a few cases, especially in Nigeria, where women have had children out of wedlock, and they have been up for death penalty or even stoning. In poorer areas in the Muslim world, this is where you see things like stoning to death, honor killings, taking the law into your own hands.
Assim como o adultério, o mandamento seguinte, não roubarás, passou por várias fases. Em épocas e culturas diferentes, foi considerado um crime capital ou uma infração menor. O ambiente determinava se o ladrão receberia um tapinha na mão ou se esta lhe seria cortada. Desde que o homem existe, por mais pobres e humildes suas condições de vida, sempre houve o bastante para inspirar o roubo. O mandamento é claro: não roubarás. Mas o que constitui o roubo, bem como o rigor das punições, mudou com o tempo. No mundo antigo, o roubo era definido pela má intenção. Roubar comida para matar a fome não era considerado crime. Os 613 mandamentos contidos nos livros do Velho Testamento, dos quais os 10 mandamentos são apenas os primeiros, falam claramente dos restos que deviam ser deixados aos pobres.
The poor have the right to go into anyone's field and eat their fill of grapes or olives, and that's not considered stealing in the Mosaic system. Thou shalt not steal does not mean the poor must starve.
O tipo mais comum de roubo no Velho Testamento é o roubo de animais. Quando o ladrão era pego, a lei mosaica determinava que oferecesse uma recompensa. Para cada boi, burro ou carneiro roubado, ele precisava pagar 2. Se já tivesse vendido ou matado os animais, o número de animais que devia dar ao proprietário subia. O roubo não era punido com pena de morte, embora o Êxodo diga que um ladrão à noite deve arcar com os riscos. Se o ladrão surpreendido à noite for ferido de morte, não haverá homicídio. Êxodo 22, 1. Executando o sequestro, considerado um tipo de roubo, a lei mosaica via o crime com tolerância, ao contrário de outras culturas antigas onde os ladrões eram mutilados.
In the ancient world, there was no fingerprinting, there was no photography, so how was the community to know who was a threat to the community? Well, you brand them. There might be a mutilation, for instance, fingers would be cut off for stealing. If we go to the Muslim world, for instance, theft would be punished in some cases with amputation of a hand.
What the idea of marking your hands was that to move you away, to mark you as somebody who steals, to be punished, and to be marked so that everyone knows that you are a robber, so you will not do it again.
Mas na Idade Média, quando as terras e as riquezas pertenciam a uma minoria, o castigo para o roubo tornou-se mais rigoroso. Na Inglaterra do século XIII, a morte era considerada a solução. O roubo de um servo do rei, de uma colher, de uma roupa, de um varal, tudo era punido pela forca.
Anything above 12 pence was considered grand theft and was therefore a capital crime. It's illegal to hunt on the royal estates, which is basically all the woods of England. What are you going to eat if you can't fish in a stream, if you can't hunt in the woods? Where are you going to get your meals legally from? And people were living on a very thin line between life and death in the Middle Ages.
Quando os colonos chegaram aos Estados Unidos no século XVI, as punições britânicas para o roubo não eram mais viáveis.
In the early part of the Puritan colony, you would not see capital punishment or the harsher punishments being used because everybody played an important part of the labor force.
In the colonies, people were not generally put to death for simple property crimes unless they just committed them over and over again. There were jails and people were in jails, but in a small community where there was a shortage of labor, the idea of locking someone up for 5 years was just simply unthinkable.
Os puritanos retomaram o antigo costume de marcar o criminoso com ferro em brasa e outras mutilações. Como em alguns estados hoje, os puritanos de Massachusetts tinham sua própria versão do sistema dos 3 crimes.
In fact, you could have one of your ears cut off. If you did it again, you'd have the other ear cut off. And if you did it a third time, then you could be hanged because they figured there's just no hope for you.
No século XVIII, roubos passaram a ser categorizados e punidos de modo diferente. Os que envolviam danos físicos eram considerados mais graves. Daí a distinção entre roubo e furto. Mas o castigo também variava dependendo de quem era o criminoso.
Theft, Enron, Kozlowski, all the white-collar criminals. We don't call it theft anymore. We call it, innovative accounting principles. But the net result's the same.
Assim como o roubo, o próximo mandamento mudou de nome. Hoje é chamado perjúrio e para alguns não é um crime, mas um detalhe técnico. Mas no mundo antigo era um crime grave, digno de um mandamento próprio. Não levantarás falso testemunho.
One of the worst abuses of any legal system is bearing false witness, falsely accusing somebody of a crime. The book of Genesis has several examples of people being falsely accused of crime.
Quando um crime era cometido na antiguidade, a maioria das provas era apresentada verbalmente.
Remember, we're long before the days of Sherlock Holmes. We're long before the days of being able to test the evidence. Part of the investigation that the elders were dependent on was interviewing witnesses. A lot depended on the trustworthiness of someone saying, yes, I saw it, yes, I'm telling the truth. That's very important.
Na lei mosaica, quem levantava falso testemunho era submetido aos mesmos castigos que o acusado pelo crime. Se a testemunha fez uma falsa deposição, vós o tratareis como premeditar a tratar seu irmão. Assim tirarás o mal de teu meio. Deuteronômio 19, 18. Hoje, o juramento de testemunhas e as penas para quem presta falso testemunho são pilares de nosso sistema legal.
We have not only taking an oath to tell the truth, but why we have consequences for failing to tell the truth, which is called prosecution for perjury. If you fail to tell the truth after swearing to tell the truth, there's going to be great consequences, which could land you in jail or worse.
Mas hoje o perjúrio é raramente processado, salvo em casos famosos.
Oh, there's no question that perjury laws can be abused. We use it, sometimes misuse perjury when we can't prove the actual crime. During the 1950s, a lot of people who were suspected of communism were not charged with being communists, but they were charged with lying when they denied that they were communists. Bill Clinton was not charged with sexual misconduct, but rather with allegedly lying about it.
Remember Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart did not get convicted of fraud. She was convicted of perjury, a violation of the Ninth Commandment.
Da cantora de rap Lil Kim ao funcionário da Casa Branca Lewis Scooter Libby, o perjúrio continua nas manchetes. Mas o público se importa com todos os 10 mandamentos igualmente?
We pick and choose which ones we like and which ones we don't. Graven images are all over America these days. We do accept the commandments about killing and robbing. We don't accept the commandments about adultery.
Mas e o último mandamento? Hoje pode ser o mais difícil de obedecer.
Hey, could you have capitalism without coveting? We all covet our neighbors' goods. That's what makes America great.
Cobiçar, desejar, ansiar, invejar. Todos os outros mandamentos dizem respeito a ações, coisas que devemos ou não devemos fazer. Mas o último mandamento é o mais problemático, pois não envolve nenhuma ação, mas uma intenção. Não cobiçarás nada que pertença ao próximo. Seria uma proibição ao que temos mais dificuldade para controlar nossos pensamentos e desejos?
Is it just the emotional, I'm jealous about what you have? Or does it mean that you shouldn't do things to pressure people to give you what's not rightfully yours?
As palavras do mandamento, como estão no Êxodo, especificam que não devemos cobiçar. Não cobiçarás a casa do teu próximo. Não cobiçarás a mulher do teu próximo, nem seu escravo, nem sua escrava, nem seu boi, nem seu jumento, nem nada que lhe pertença. Êxodo 20:17. O Deuteronômio acrescenta os campos de teu próximo e muda a mulher para o topo da lista. Tradutores modernos trocaram a referência de escravos para criados, mas o que permanece é uma descrição da vida dos israelitas.
According to the Mosaic Law, all the people are given a certain portion of tribal land. All males of early Israel had a portion of tribal land. We might say today it was their piece of the action, and it was their land, and all wealth came from land. So it was rather evenly distributed, and the idea was this is not to be coveted, this is not to be taken from its equitable distribution.
Os mandamentos não mencionam ouro, prata ou objetos de luxo, mas só os artigos mais essenciais da época.
Your ox, your donkey, your family members, particularly your wife, the essential aspects of what in a peasant society are required for you to exist.
Segundo alguns, a cobiça está no final dos 10 mandamentos, porque é a causa da desobediência aos outros 9. Em várias passagens da Bíblia, o verbo cobiçar é seguido por um ato proibido: roubar, matar, cometer adultério. Vi no meio dos despojos 200 ciclos de prata e uma barra de ouro, e cobiçando tomei-os e escondi-os na terra no meio da minha tenda. Josué 7:21.
We tend to get into trouble if we start coveting someone else's things because we're going to go and take them. We tend to get in trouble if we go ahead and sleep with other people's wives. Those break down sort of how we work as a society, and the Ten Commandments say, don't go there.
It's important to understand that to covet the property of your neighbor is not just to think, gee, wouldn't that be nice if I had that stuff? It's to make plans. It's to do the things that you do in order to make sure you get them. In other words, it's the carrying out of the act.
Algumas sociedades antigas tomaram medidas para evitar essas tentações.
Traditionally, women were kept separate or aside so that other men would not look at them in a desirous way. Men have uncontrollable desire according to the Quran and cannot control themselves, and women can. And therefore women have to be modest. There's different kinds of veiling and hijabs in Islam. The whole idea of hijab came, hajaba, is to, separate, to curtail.
The commandment is more about not creating the conditions where, in fact, coveting would happen. If the commandment says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, I should perhaps think about not looking in my neighbor's window, for example, while she's undressing.
Mas com o marketing e a comunicação de massa do mundo moderno, como não violar esse mandamento?
Coveting is basically the most human emotion. I want what I can get, even if the other person wants it as well.
We all covet our neighbor's goods. That's what makes America great. Our market-driven economy is an economy of coveting. And so the Ten Commandments are really not particularly suitable to America.
Essa percepção tem provocado muitos debates. Em uma série de litígios recentes, lutou-se por exibir ou remover os 10 mandamentos de tribunais e locais públicos. Alguns acham que são parte essencial da história moral e legal americana.
I think it's a good idea to post these 10 commandments because it affirms the common good. It affirms that we are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. And it also affirms that there is a law higher than our laws.
Mas para outros, essa exibição viola a separação constitucional entre igreja e Estado.
the Ten Commandments issue comes up all the time because you have this constant tension in society between people who say, look, this isn't just about common morality. It's about religion, and we should all be following the religion, and unless we do so, we're compromising. And other people are saying, look, I'm willing to follow the laws and the morality, but religion's a different thing. That's off limits by the Constitution. That's personal. And we've never actually resolved that. We have the separation of church and state, and yet the reality is that much of our laws is based upon religious concepts.
Os 10 Mandamentos tiveram um papel na formação das leis e da moralidade americana, mas se continuam a desempenhar o mesmo papel, esta é uma questão polêmica. Para alguns, os mandamentos pertencem ao passado.
The Ten Commandments reflect progress at a particular point in time. And they are a very important part of our heritage, but they do not govern us today, nor should they.
Para outros, são parte ativa do direito americano.
The Ten Commandments today still serve as a springboard for applying their principles or their general equity in many, many contexts. Today, our legislators grapple with how to apply general principles that affirm life, that affirm family, that affirm rest, that affirm telling the truth, and so forth. And so what we're seeing today in many ways is a recapitulation of what Moses did after the Ten Commandments were given. We have to apply these general principles in specific ways. We're not dealing with dry, dusty laws, but laws given by a living God.
Hoje são poucos os mandamentos cuja violação é punida por lei, em parte devido à diversidade americana.
We don't have a law that makes it a crime to obey and worship a different God. That doesn't seem compatible with civic society, particularly in the most heterogeneous, multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic country in the history of the world, the United States.
Mas nem todos concordam com isso.
American was uniquely informed by a Judeo-Christian ethic, and to deny that or to alter that is really to airbrush history. We ought not to airbrush history simply because there may be people from other backgrounds.
A discussão sobre exibir ou não os 10 mandamentos centra-se, ironicamente, em um prédio decorado com referências bíblicas.
The Ten Commandments already are posted in the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. So there's certainly nothing unique or cutting edge about posting them in a court of law.
Não há como não notar Moisés retratado em frisos dentro e fora da Suprema Corte. Mas ele não está sozinho, e sim acompanhado de outros legisladores como Hammurabi, Salomão e Confúcio. E as placas que segura estão em branco ou dispostas de modo que apenas os mandamentos do 6º ao 10º, as leis morais e não religiosas, fiquem à vista. A controvérsia gerou processos contra monumentos aos 10 mandamentos em exibição em Idaho, Indiana, Texas e outros locais do país. Mas esses memoriais não tinham como fim pregar tradições antigas. Foram doados por um grupo cívico, a Fraternal Order of Eagles, apoiado pela Paramount Pictures para promover o lançamento de Os 10 Mandamentos em 1956.
In fact, it was only as a publicity stunt that Cecil B. DeMille had, monuments of the Ten Commandments made and sent to courthouses around the country as a way of promoting his movie.
Mas os verdadeiros 10 mandamentos, o texto complexo e variado do Êxodo, Deuteronômio e do Pentateuco não precisam de um monumento para assegurar seu lugar na história humana ou no coração dos leitores.
I think everybody should know the Ten Commandments, should study them as a historical basis for current law. Plainly, you can't understand American law or morality without having a deep understanding of the Bible.
The thing that's amazing about the Ten Commandments is that a doctrine that came up thousands of years ago lives and breathes today. It transforms, it changes, it means different things, but the basic principles are still at stake. There is nothing simple about the Ten Commandments. You can read the words, but what those words mean and how they're effectuated today changes all the time.